Hi everyone, it's May. It's my favorite month, and it's a very special time. It's 1 year since the release of the Essential Guide to Trauma Sensitive Yoga: How to Create Safer Spaces for All. This book, which I'm so proud of, published by Shambhala Publications, really puts together 10 years of experience out in the field, working with trauma survivors in all different places, all different demographics, and also training yoga teachers, training schools, and training companies to be more trauma aware and sensitive. I'm just so proud of the book. It's great for anyone who wants to learn more about themselves and how they might have been impacted by generational trauma, blind spots, biases, and how they might be more aware of the people they're in space with, right? We might understand folks' reactions differently when we realize that all of us are impacted by trauma in some way, especially since COVID, and especially since the fast pace of this world is not what we have been evolved for. So I think this book has something for everyone. It has over 260 photos of yoga, all different ways of doing poses, of doing shapes with our bodies in a chair, on a mat, in bed as well, different body types, different ages, and it has the stories of survivors who I've trained in trauma sensitivity. They share their own stories, what's worked for them, what's worked for their students. So some powerful stories in there. Like I said, I'm pretty proud of this moment 1 year later. It's called The Essential Guide to Trauma Sensitive Yoga because it really is a workbook you can have with you and take with you and read over and over again, underline, write in the margins. There's really big margins. It's one of those books that you want to revisit again and again because you'll get something new out of it. And so I'd love to just read you a couple reviews of the book. This is from Melissa Smith. I was so excited to receive this book in the mail. I am an amateur yogi and an aspiring school counselor who believes that trauma-informed anything is important. I especially love that photos were added to this book for added clarification. I am excited to use this book as a guide for myself and looking forward to eventually sharing this knowledge with others. This book is essential for any instructor who wants to be trauma-informed and very helpful for anyone who practices yoga or wants to start but doesn't know how. I would give this book more stars if I could. Wow. Well, it doesn't get better than that, and thank you. Book was also endorsed by some pretty well-known yogis. Sean Corden said the Essential Guide for Trauma Sensitive Yoga is a comprehensive resource for teachers to understand the complex nuances of trauma and the subtle and overt ways it can present itself in our students. As teachers, we have a responsibility to serve the whole person, and that includes sensitizing ourselves to the various ways that trauma lives uniquely in each body, how it influences the mind and perceptions, and can affect one's health and emotional wellness. Lara Land definitely provides the necessary guidance, insights, and best practices so that facilitators can support their students on their journey toward healing with more mindfulness, awareness, and skill. This excellent resource should be required reading in any teacher training course. Thank you, Sean Korn. I believe that's true. I hope you'll tell your local yoga studio and yoga teacher friends. You can get the book off my website, laraland.us, or on Amazon, anywhere you like to purchase books. And so today I'm very excited to re-release a conversation that I did with another podcast host. Her name is Tessa Tovar from Outside the Studio, and she interviewed me last year, right around when the book was coming out, about the book and questions for me about my teaching and my training. So I hope you enjoy this interview. Here you go.
All right. So here we are. Another amazing episode of Outside the Studio. This is Tessa. I am so beyond honored to have Lara Land here today, who is such a multi-talented person and has done and will, I'm sure, continue to do so many important things in the realm of yoga and wellness. And so I'm really excited to address a few topics. Number one, trauma-informed yoga. She is releasing a book May 2nd, The Essential Guide to Trauma-Sensitive Yoga, and also has a podcast called Beyond Trauma. And I mean, I feel like I could just go on and on listing a bunch of accolades about you, Lara, but I'm wondering if there's anything you want to add to your introduction, anything you want to say right off the bat to listeners.
Oh, well, no, you hit the important points. I've had a very deep focus on trauma sensitivity and trauma sensitivity training in the yoga space for the last 2 decades. I also believe that this kind of training and sensitivity should be in all spaces, in schools, with coaches in sports, in the workplace. Their trauma is pervasive, and in any group setting, there is someone there who is a survivor or actively in a trauma response. And so having even a slight bit of education can make us more aware, more sensitive, and more kind, and can stop cycle of trauma.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this podcast, since the moment it came across my desk, it was like, oh my God, hell yes, I want to have this conversation. Absolutely, I want to talk to Lara. And I think what would be so important or helpful is to at least kind of back up a little bit and define what we mean when we say trauma, because in my experience, and I'd like to hear from you, it exists on a spectrum of experience. I think oftentimes we think, oh, I wasn't traumatized. As a child, I had a fine upbringing. I wasn't abused. And then we can, get into adulthood and like understand, oh, wow, that was a really traumatic experience, or even experience trauma in adulthood. It doesn't have to be this one traumatic event that happened to us when we were small, but it can be
Yes.
that also. So would you define it in your words?
Yeah, I mean, we could stop there and spend the whole episode on that question. It's complicated, in this world of memes to describe something like this. And it's really important to get all the different subtleties that you're talking about. So I think there's a couple things to unpack here. Trauma, first of all, there are traumatic events, and then there is whether we are traumatized by them. And the same event could happen to two different people. One person's system could be able to process that event, and the other person's, it could be too much for that system, right? Overcapacity. Just like you could think about, any kind of computer or system that's just, it has too much energy running through it, right? And that, whether that happens, whether one person is traumatized from an event or not, it has to do with a ton of different factors. So what's the previous experience? What's the genetic experience? Is that person able to get away, or in some fashion assert their agency in that moment? That's a really, really important part, I'm sure we'll come back to in the conversation. So there's a really big difference in the experience if we're able to leave or fight back versus if we can't. And some of that, mainly all of that is not really our choice. Sometimes there's a lot of shame around trauma, and around a very common traumatic response that the body has, which is to freeze. And that's not a choice. That's not, playing dead or pretending. That is, the body freezes, and there is no choice. That's not a conscious choice that the person is making. Although, survivors will often feel like, why didn't I go? Things like that. So there's so much going on here in the case of a kind of instantaneous or ongoing traumatic events. Like you said, a lot of us think about trauma, we think about a single event, an attack, a medical event, and sometimes we don't even talk enough about that, especially as young children. Something simple like, I fell off my bike when I was 6 and I knocked out some teeth, and I'm suddenly on this hospital bed, lights, people I don't know, right? And that there's a different experience if there's a friendly face smiling at you and explaining what's happening versus you're strapped down, no one talks to you. Those make different experiences happen in our bodies. And the way that others are to you in that moment can be the difference between something that years later you realize, oh my gosh, I'm really traumatized from that, versus you were able to process it and understand it.
Mm.
Um, and like you said, there are kind of these big traumatic events, and there are more subtle traumas. And I don't want to. This is where it gets. We really have to be crafty with our words and really clear about, there is a difference, right, between um just not getting what we want in life is not a trauma, right? We're not, and we sometimes overuse the word, oh, I'm so traumatized, I didn't get, into this restaurant or whatever it is. And we don't want to equate that with real trauma that folks have gone through. And there are subtle traumas that can build up and put us, where that one drop of water takes the cup over. And it might not always be this thing that is clear and that you see in this one instant. I mean, some of the biggest traumas, like racial-based trauma, are instances where someone is constantly discriminated against, and it could be these small ways, and then it's a feeling, like we talked about with agency, where a person can't be free and live their free way. And eventually that becomes race-based trauma, and there's a traumatic response where the body shuts down, or is hypervigilant, and all those things that happen in a trauma response. So it's not to say one is bigger, one is smaller, because one happened in a single moment versus one happened many, many, many moments and then went into a traumatic response.
Yeah. And this is probably, I don't know if loaded question is the right word, but I'm curious if you teach on the spectrum of indicators. Okay, I'm learning about trauma. I'm learning about defining trauma. I'm learning about, okay, how do I understand if there's something there within me somatically, maybe that's either conscious or unconscious, that isn't really feeling processed, and I have some sort of specific behavioral outcomes that may or may not be related to that. Do you ever kind of talk about the indicators of trauma response and what that might look like to help people identify whether or not they are experiencing or have experienced trauma?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so that's the level where, like, we all have unprocessed stuff in our body, and that's why many of us come to yoga and we might not realize it, at the time. But if you're practicing, you start to feel like emotions coming out and stuff coming out, or any kind of, practice. At some point, most people in their lives will have a realization, like, wow, I'm carrying some stuff. Maybe some won't if they don't do any self-inquiry, but many of us will get there. And that stuff is in our body. There's generational trauma, right? For instance, if your grandparents or great grandparents were in a famine, were in a war, okay, most of us have some of that history that gets passed down, and it gets passed down in multiple ways, and it's scientifically studied and known now that it gets passed down in multiple ways. So one way it just gets passed down is in the assumptions in the family,
Mm.
right? There just might be ways that the family is, you know um I know in my family it was like, lateness was really, really bad. And there are just assumptions and ways that we view the world that are based on those past traumas and are passed down. And even though, like, everything is fine now, the family still reenacts that, and acts in these ways as if those traumas, those traumatic events, are still there. But because we're, the fish in the water, we don't see the water. We often just assume, like, this is the way life is, or this is the way people should be. And don't, until maybe later, when we go maybe move or go to school somewhere or travel, and start to see, like, oh, other people have different ways of seeing the world and functioning in the world, that some of the things that we've been doing are really survival responses from generations back. So maybe that will ring true for some folks listening, and it's really valuable to just sit with that and think about that. Like, where did I get this idea?
Mm.
And then the other way is genetically, and epigenetics, which is still very new science, very, very exciting. Where we scientists have discovered that genes are turned on or turned off based on these traumas in our body that come down through at least 2 generations back. So we can have more chance of having certain illnesses based on family trauma from a generation or 2 generations back. So this stuff stays with us.
That's so wild. I
Yeah.
remember learning about epigenetics and being like, whoa. It just felt like for me, similar to your starting to talk about your experience in your family about having certain indicators of trauma show up. And for me, it feels both epigenetic and what was the one you said before?
Generational.
Yeah, generational.
Yeah.
Um, and so both of those are true. And I mean, I think this is why I'm asking this question, because it's so nuanced and it's so layered, and it's not just one indicator, and oftentimes it's multiple things that can exist
Yeah.
simultaneously. And so you're a yoga teacher, you're a yoga teacher trainer. You've done work in prisons and clinical settings and in the public yoga studio space. So I really want to talk about yoga's role in trauma specifically. Like, so I'm thinking about this from, again, multiple lenses, but I'm thinking about this right now from the lens of like the person who experiences a traumatic event, who knows they've experienced this traumatic event, who has these very clear trauma indicators, and is told by a healer or a physician or someone, right? Oh, go try yoga. That will help. And so then we have this kind of like person who maybe they haven't tried yoga before, but they've been recommended a yoga practice, walking into a room that might be very triggering for them based on their experience, based on their trauma.
Yeah.
Um, so can we break down that? That's a specific example, and I know there are multiple, and yoga has many roles in trauma, but where within that one specific example would you say yoga's role is in the healing of trauma? And what kind
Mm.
of class might you suggest this particular person go to look for?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. And that scenario really could happen. A lot of doctors prescribe yoga without even really knowing, what they're saying. They just heard it's good. They don't even often do it themselves. And we know that there's so many kinds of yoga. Whenever someone comes to me and they say, I don't like yoga, or, people feel like because I'm a yoga teacher, they have to apologize. Like, I don't do yoga. I'm sorry. Can we still talk? Yes. But when they do say that, I say, it's like saying I don't like food. There are so many kinds, right? There's Mexican, there's Italian, and then you have to get to the chef, it's like the yoga teacher, and the restaurant, which is like the space that you're in. So it often takes a lot of trials before we find a space that we're comfortable in, and where we can say, oh, I like yoga. But and that's why it is so important to get that right, because when someone, especially someone in that instance that you're describing, walks in and has a negative experience, the chance that they're going to try that again is going to be very slim, right? Because the stakes are so high, and especially if it's presented as the medicine. And I always say, as a kind of theme in my life, I always say, or as a kind of mantra in my life, I always say, like, the medicine is like a little bit of the poison, and that's kind of how it is, right? We in yoga, we're exposing ourselves to nervous system stimulation and to some risk, and it should be the right amount, so that the body can handle it, and not get overstimulated. So, and with trauma, If a place is too quiet, too calming, um, this can also be really activating for a trauma survivor, because that silence is really like they're usually one of the things that happens after trauma is hypervigilance. We have hypervigilance and hypovigilance. So either looking around, like any sound feels like there's danger, or any movement, any light, anything could feel like the danger is present and we're back in the moment of the trauma. Um, or we might just disconnect, zone out, kind of, not feel anything. And usually, most often, there's both. And one can swing between both being really like hyper vigilant and sensitive to everything and numb to everything. So what's the answer to that question? I mean, I wish they would go to a very specifically trauma sensitive or trauma informed yoga class, or look and know that the teacher has some trauma sensitivity training. Because there's no style that's best for a trauma survivor. Trauma survivors are, just regular people, maybe you.
Mhm.
It's not like someone has a sign and it's like, I'm a trauma survivor, I only like hatha yoga or yin yoga or whatever style yoga. I mean, it's more about um some other things that you take into account as a teacher when you're teaching, language that you use that is more open, exploratory, invitational than maybe the style of teaching that so many teachers come to me after their 200-hour and they take a 20-hour trauma sensitivity training with me, and they are like, oh, I have to relearn everything because I was told stand here, say a verb, say an action. Like, I don't even know, there's a formula that a lot of teachers learn. It's like body part, action, place, or something. It's so long ago that I did my training, but they come to me and they tell me that, and we don't speak like that in trauma sensitive spaces. It's exploratory. It's helping people to reconnect, because like I said, there's dissociation that happens often in trauma, where many people who, when they're experiencing the trauma, they feel that as if they're outside their bodies watching it, and sometimes they don't fully come back into their bodies, or they tend to disassociate. Dissociation is it's like you said, things are on a spectrum. At its kind of lowest level, it's daydreaming, right? It's driving the car and we're somewhere else. And at its more serious levels, it's like we're watching our life like a movie. And this is why you see sometimes, in survivors, this feeling of like not really being connected to their lives, and therefore maybe taking more risks,
Mhm.
not being able to really feel, and feel that connection. It's like, who cares then, right? It's like some of my friends who couldn't smell or taste during COVID, and like trying to smell like the hottest thing, right? You're trying to feel. So I mean, there's a lot of reasons why trauma survivors tend to be more likely to have future trauma, and this is one of them. Um, so I forgot where I got there, but yeah. So helping reconnect to the body, um, as much as the person wants to and feels ready to, because it's not our job. And this is another confusion I think that happens with yoga teachers, is feeling like it's our job to fix or save someone, especially
Mhm.
in that scenario. The doctor sent them there, and now it's like, oh my gosh, I have to give them the best class of their lives, right?
Yeah.
And that's not it, right? It's actually handing it back
Mhm.
to the person, right? You're the one who knows best what works for you. And every response to trauma is different, and every response is valid. The body is so brilliant at keeping us alive, at protecting us from feeling what would be unbearable. It is so smart. And we don't know what a person goes back to. We don't know that they're ready to drop down their guard or have this breakthrough. So, thinking of ourselves not as an expert, but as a partner in relationship with this person, and as a um, someone that can be there for them, and that can validate what they're feeling, even if they're not feeling anything. Yeah. what does nothing feel like? Or, and then, what would it feel like if? So these are kind of exploratory terms instead of turn this way, do this, it has to look like this, and giving lots of have to, and much more open and curious about the person's experience. And then curious, open about everything, and especially things that are highly, that have a high potential for being triggering, like laying down in shavasana and flick flat on, with your eyes closed, where there's all these strangers in the room, right? Like, why can't a person sit up against the wall? Why can't they keep their eyes open? Why does it have to be just one way?
Mhm. Do you believe it's possible to teach a trauma sensitive yoga class to an all levels class? Because like we talked about, trauma exists on a spectrum, and all of us have experienced trauma in some way, whether it be on an extreme setting or a lower level setting. And I'm not sure if it's like this in your neck of the woods, but over here in the Pacific Northwest, um, if I were someone that was told by a doctor or someone in a healing circle to go find a yoga class to heal from trauma specifically, most classes don't really say that. So I think it's really important that you pointed out, look at the teacher's bio, see and understand if they have trauma sensitive training. And also, just looking at a description of a class isn't that helpful to get a good understanding. So yes, I agree with you 100%. There's a lot of trial and error in figuring out what works for you and your needs, and they're going to be so specific to you. And where I'm going with this is, take me a while to get there. Where I'm going with this is here in the Pacific Northwest, most classes are billed as all levels. We don't really have like a beginning yoga class, a level 1, a level 2, or really even, and I get the reason why, like we want it to be inclusive. Yes, absolutely. We want everyone to feel like yoga is for you, and you just need to find which flavor of yoga. I love the chef analogy, the restaurant analogy, the food analogy, because it's true. There's so many different styles of yoga. So is there a way to teach a public studio class, an all level setting, with this trauma sensitive lens and kind of have it reach everyone in the room?
Yeah. I mean, I think that was sort of what I wanted to get to. So, thank you, because, what I wanted to say is, like, just because I'm a trauma survivor doesn't mean I don't like power yoga, or
Mhm.
whatever style yoga. I mean, that has nothing to do with it, right? Um it doesn't mean because I'm trauma survivor that I necessarily want a calm yoga. Different movements can be healing, stronger movements, softer movements. It's not the movement, it's it's really in the relationship, the safety that's in the room. And so, I would suggest, going up to that teacher, coming early and going up to that teacher before class and trying to have a conversation, seeing how open they are to, you doing what works for you. I mean, a really good teacher will know how to, because, I might not know what works for me, right? If I might be very disconnected from knowing that, the way I see the yoga practice is a way of learning that, of learning myself, of maybe of relearning that. And the way I see a really excellent, um, advanced trauma sensitive teacher is that they can really craft that experience, that experience where the student comes to know themselves, um, through offering different choices, not too many, not too little, right? That balance, because too many is like, wait, what was I supposed to do? But just enough, and that open, and or visualize it, because we know, again, from study after study, that visualization is, just as effective as doing. So if none of that's working for you, visualize it, imagine it, breathe, and see it in your mind, right? So that can always be an option. That's something you can give. But some teachers, like, they don't know what to offer. And it's important not to say, like, or just do whatever, but to have some different choices so that it's it's open, and then to leave it then open-ended. Or another thing that just makes it more trauma sensitive is just how we give like adjustments and feedback. In a truly trauma sensitive space, I wouldn't give really adjustments, because I would be creating a space where people feel so accepted in what feels right for them that they wouldn't be trying to impress me or anyone else in the room, and therefore they wouldn't be putting themselves into dangerous kind of positions where they can get hurt.
Mhm.
This is a larger conversation, but I think a lot of this fear of people getting hurt from like bending a knee too far is, for me, I don't see that. I haven't seen that in my decades of teaching, that people get hurt from that. I think they get hurt from not listening to their own bodies because they think there's a way that they need to do something. And that also happens when teachers praise. This is something I think that could be more talked about, is the damage that praise can do, right? Because if I call out someone next to you with like compliment, great crow today, and then like I'm next to that person, I'm like, oh, is mine not good? What am I doing? Maybe I should look more like that person. So I try to do it like them, even though I'm me, all those things that happen when there's like singling out. Now I'm not listening to myself anymore, which I believe is the whole journey.
Mhm.
So now I'm totally out of that. So we have to find ways to maybe cheer on our class, but not because the form of one person looks the way that we think it should.
Yeah.
Celebrate people that are listening. I'll celebrate, look at all the different choices happening in the room right now. That's amazing.
Mm. Oh, I love that as a suggestion. That's really helpful. Yeah, because I'm also thinking about this from the lens of the person who maybe is new to teaching yoga, or has been teaching yoga for a while, and trauma is something that's just new to them in general, in terms of wanting to integrate it into their class. What are some helpful ways that we can bring? And it's kind of the same question I asked, but I guess I'm wording it differently. And you talked about language, invitational, creating a safe space. I want to talk a little bit more about that. I definitely want to come back to agency in terms of creating that sense of agency within oneself, because I think that's just so integral to yoga in and of itself. And I think it gets looked over when we do things like compare ourselves to other, in the case of being praised, or the person next to us being praised, and us comparing ourselves to them and feeling like, oh, mine doesn't look like that. Doesn't that mean I'm not good enough? So all these things that can happen as the
Even if we're
teacher.
praised, right? If we're
Yeah.
praised, we're going to try to repeat that. I
Mhm.
mean, I see it, I do it with my own child. I praise a behavior that I want more of,
Yeah.
right? But then you come in the next class like wanting to do that. That's all there. Like I want to do the same what I did last time, and then like the teacher doesn't praise you that day. You've now ended up in this whole relationship of power that is not the purpose of why we're there at all.
Mhm. Yeah. I think that gets lost often, even if it's not related to a trauma. But to me, that's when the asana, or the shape, or whatever it is we're doing with our body, um, gets in the way of the yoga itself. Like,
Exactly.
why have we been
Exactly.
practicing yoga? Is it actually to do a beautiful crow pose? Maybe that's
Right.
why you're doing it. But I think we lose sight of the actual purpose. Um, so yeah, is there anything else you would want to highlight in terms of a teacher who wants to start to integrate some of this trauma sensitivity into their teachings?
Yeah. I mean, the first and the hardest thing is to sit with yourself and ask yourself some of the hard questions, like, what is yoga? Why am I in this yoga thing? Why am I teaching? And, usually, and to be honest with what comes up, when we say, what is yoga? What images pop up? Those are images that you probably didn't put there yourself. They were like probably given to you, by the industry, or, whatever else is in your mind programming from the outside, and see what pops up and question it, and figure out first what this is that we're really trying to do here. To me, yoga is a practice by which we can come to know ourselves better and make more artful choices in our lives, both with ourselves and in relationship with others. Um, so it's that study. And so I think knowing that when I go into any room, that's what I'm there to facilitate. Right. So before I fix someone, make an adjustment, say anything, I'm asking myself if it's in service of that. How is that allowing the person to get deeper into who they are and have more agency and make better choices for themselves? And if it's not, then maybe I'll stay quiet, or I need to reword that, or I need to think about that. So that's like the first thing, journaling and asking those questions. There's some of them in the book. Um, and getting to know your own stuff, because all our own stuff is in the room. And and everything we've been taught again and programmed about leading and teaching and even healing, most of us come into this because we care. And again, like I said, it's to me, I think things are like a double-sided coin, and the thing that's great about us is also the thing that has its like shadow side that we have to watch, right? Because that desire to fix or heal actually can get in the way of a person finding their own path, their own healing. And so we might have a good intention, and probably we did, and that's why we were drawn to this work or any healing work. And we can't heal or fix anyone, and it's not for us to decide when someone is ready or wants to let go of certain patterns. Like we said, we don't know a person's whole situation. And so can we just be there and accept and see the body's brilliance? And when I say body, I mean the mind body. I think of it all as one. I mean, it is one. So this mind body spirit system person that we're looking at, can we just be with them um and really honor all the brilliance that has protected them and brought them into this space without trying to change anything. So that's some of the deeper work, to think about before we go into class. We also know that bodies co-regulate. So what before you walk in to teach your class, are you rushing in off the subway or off of traffic? Um, this might seem like small stuff, but this is really, really important. If you're coming in like all like this, the other nervous systems in the room pick up on that stress. So, a couple breaths, settling yourself into space is really important for helping other nervous systems to calm down. And not denying anyone's experience. If someone tells you, this didn't work for me, or I'm finding this, like, that's not landing right for me when you use this term or whatever. Can we hear that? So often we're like, well, I've been studying yoga for 20 years, can I hear that? Like, or even if we just got our training, like that's what they taught me in my training. Like, we tighten up, right? And our work is to open to that. Man, like, I'm really sorry that we don't know what's going to trigger anyone, and we can never promise a completely safe space. My book, the subtitle is How to Create Safer Spaces. And the publisher said, can we say safe spaces? I said, no, we can't promise safe spaces, because we never know. It could be, it could be a word that you find very benign, but for someone else it isn't. We just don't know. So we just try to create as safe as atmosphere as possible. And then we take ownership when things don't go that way. So that's a lot of the deeper stuff. But just on a more like surface level, right? Like, are you aware of like the exits? Are they open, right? Can people come and go if they need to? Are you like weird about no one can leave? Sometimes I've had instances where I've need to just step out, and I gained so much pride and strength. These are like, as I'm telling you, I'm remembering certain instances that I was able to come back in, and that's hard, especially once you leave, because there's embarrassment having to leave and all that stuff. But then going through that process of leaving and then returning and finishing the class, it gave me so much strength and resilience. And those have been some of the most powerful moments. So, can people come and go if they need to? Um, just like not gendering folks, right? I mean, that's a quick thing we can do. Just looking at, words that we use. Can we say friends, folks, practitioners? We don't know who's in our space. Can we just right off the bat just get rid of like pose names that are gendered and don't need to be? And also here's a big one is not prescribing. This is one of my big like ticks. It's like if I go into a class and the teacher says like this pose is going to make you calm, or this pose releases relationship trauma, or this, and it's like if I'm not feeling that, then I feel like I'm doing something wrong, or you're kind of putting that experience, you're dropping that thought into someone's mind. So you can actually like, especially if a person is really open at a certain point in class, you can create that experience for them. It's kind of like a hypnosis. So
Mhm.
just, I don't think we should tell people like, even if we've been taught, and even if, yes, certain poses have a chance of stimulating parasympathetic, slowing the body down. It's not the same for everyone. It's not everyone's experience. Why do we have to say this is what's going to happen? Why can't we just explore, and whatever that experience is for you in that shape is valid and true?
Mm.
So those are like simple things that we can change off the bat. Room setup, I mentioned the exits, just like keeping a pathway there, letting people be near an exit if they need to, or be near you. I remember when I was a younger teacher and I would get annoyed, like, why does that person always have to be in the same spot all the time? Like, they should stretch themselves and try a different spot. Well, now looking back, I think, they needed, that was a comfort that they needed to be there, whatever they had going on, just knowing they were right there in that spot was enough to make them feel safe to maybe explore more kind of unsafety, in a balance, or in all these kind of scary postures and breaths that we put ourselves into. Um, if you want more, I'll give one or two more. I know
Yeah,
I can go
yeah,
on.
please. I do want to talk about trauma-informed yoga in a clinical setting,
Mm,
but I think a large part of the audience is mainly teach in public setting studios. So I think all this stuff is so helpful. So yes, please, one or two more. Continue.
sure. Um, I'll give two more. So they're both to do with timing. So one is the end class on time. And a lot of times we think that, we're giving them an extra 5 minutes, we're giving them an extra 10 minutes, like it's like this gift of more time and more yoga. But that can be really, really triggering. If I could just get this hour class in and I set up my life like that, and like I feel like I'm being kept, and I'm not allowed to leave and like all that stuff. It's actually not a gift. um, and so just being really respectful of people's time in that way. Again, we don't know what anyone is going back to. If they might be sneaking this in whatever way, or it might be challenging for folks to get to class, in the same way. I know it can be hard, especially for new teachers, but if you can let people kind of come in, if they're a little bit of leeway on time, it's just so hard for people to get to class. I think when they get there, it's so great.
Mhm.
um, and then the other thing is timing in poses. So, especially in trauma sensitivity, I think we really like to know how long you're going to ask me to be in this posture. And I can decide then if I can stay for one more breath, or if I'm going into what Dan Siegel calls like out of the window of tolerance. So I'm no longer in the growth space, but I'm now dysregulated, and I'm not actually going to grow more resilient from that. So like we really want to start to allow more breath, more space, more capacity slowly. If we're tight after trauma, it's not about this big opening, because actually that can swing us back into trauma response. So it's like, you can lose all that ground of healing. So you want to move slowly. And a person knows, okay, I can stay for one more breath. If your breath count, I just actually posted about this today, if your breath count is like really steady, so if I'm counting 1, 2, 3, so I work with it's in my book, and I work with yoga teachers on this, like how to get really like that, so that when you're really asking someone, can you stay for 1 or 2 more breaths, they know what that amount of time is really that they're being asked to stay in that challenging position for.
Oh, I love that. That's actually, I've never heard anyone, as it relates to trauma informed yoga, talk about timing. And so I find that so helpful. Thank you for including that. I'm really glad we added those 1 to 2. Um, so I want to hear about your experience of teaching yoga in the clinical setting for those that are interested in going into the clinical setting. And so when I say clinical setting, I'm talking about maybe taking yoga into prisons, juvenile detention centers, hospitals, elder care facilities, things like that, where yoga is probably going to look a lot different.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to hear from you how you might approach these different settings, what yoga might look like, what a class structure might look like. That's a lot. So if it's too much for this
No.
conversation today, that's totally fine. But please, please tell us what your experience has been and what you would
Yeah.
suggest.
Yeah. And if people want more, I have it. So I'll do like a quick background. I went to Rwanda in 2007, 2008 for 3 months, and specifically to bring yoga to genocide survivors there as part of a trial program with healthcare and yoga. And when I came back from that, I was just really changed, and I really wanted to do something similar, but in my neighborhood and in a place where I would stay, because I saw a lot of what happens in the kind of NGO world where people come and go, and programs they're just a couple months and then the people leave. And in trauma, often with folks who've been through trauma, there is a lot of abandonment. So it's really important to like show up and keep showing up. And I'll skip long story short, but I formed a nonprofit called 3.5 Acres Yoga, and we train teachers in yoga sensitivity, and then we place them in some of the settings that you mentioned. So we work with folks coming out of incarceration, so not necessarily in prison, but trying to come back into society and all of that. We work with a lot of domestic abuse survivors, so in some shelters, folks dealing with food insecurity and housing insecurity, especially LGBTQIA youth who've been kicked out of their homes. Folks dealing with justice issues like incarceration or like immigration issues. So a lot of different settings. And some of the things to think about, if that's, if you're that person that wants to go into kind of service yoga, actually, again, I put a whole list of things to consider before you start in my book, because you really want to think about this, like I said, before you go in and overpromise. It might feel right now like teaching for free. Fine, I can give an hour a week, and that's great. But how are you going to feel in 2 or 3 months? Because you might start to feel like, well, I really need to get compensated for this. And anytime kind of bitterness sets in, we really can restart those cycles of trauma and be more harmful than helpful. If you're teaching yoga and you're not feeling good about what you're offering, people are feeling that and they're picking up that energy. So, some of the things we do, we put 2 teachers in every class if we can. Even sometimes the classes are just 3 or 4 or 5 people, but there's always a second teacher, and there are numerous reasons for that. One of them is in case a teacher leaves. Look, we're mostly yoga teachers, we're freelancers, we're doing a million things. We move, life changes. It's not that you have to commit your life, but that there will be some consistency there with a face that's known, and that the program will continue. There's also a reason we put often 2 teachers in is so that one can be talking, one can be demoing, so that one can be demoing a pose standing, one can be demoing a pose, the same pose in the chair, one may be on the mat. So in most of those settings, in many of those settings, we don't have mats. We're teaching chair yoga, which by the way can be very also challenging. Can sweat in a chair yoga class. Not that you have to sweat to do yoga, but we just have these ideas about things. So often we're teaching chair yoga. We teach at the food bank. It's like a open, loud kitchen. So you might have sounds, you might have scents. You might have people walking in and out. So these are very different settings where folks aren't usually in yoga clothes, right? So you're going to need to look at who's in front of you, what is appropriate for them to do in the clothing that they're in, and have at least some education in accessible yoga, meaning chair yoga, how to offer a pose, with a wall, with a chair. And it's interesting because when I teach, I don't teach with a lot of other props, because when you think about going into these settings, there's not a lot of storage where we can store like, bolsters and blocks. So I want teachers to be able to teach with like a chair and a mat, and that's often, I think, all we need. I like to give everyone if we're teaching in a setting with chair and mat, everyone gets the chair and the mat, even the person that says like they're never going to use the mat. And that's kind of being trauma sensitive and thinking about, well, let that person have the same amount of space as the other person. And also, maybe they will want to, they change their mind, but they don't want to interrupt the class. So you're always trying to anticipate someone's needs. Like do that extra. Think about what could come up for them. And also just safety with chairs. If anyone's starting to experiment or knows chair yoga, chairs can slide. So it's just great to have everyone have the same setup, and then they can decide. So in those settings, a lot of times we're using chairs. And you really want to build a relationship with the program director, like at the shelter, or the team that's there, because they're the ones that are with your practitioners like every day. You're probably coming in as a yoga teacher once a week. So having all those people like on your side doing the yoga also is great. They're experiencing a lot of secondary and tertiary trauma themselves usually, because when you work in highly traumatized settings, that happens. So it's great if they can also practice. Also, like the buy-in, then other people will practice also. And they just know the practitioners better in case of something like a flashback. Um, if a flashback happens, you really want that team. I should say, like, when you mentioned about doctors maybe recommending yoga, that I really feel strongly that yoga is a great part of a web of healing practices that could be offered to a trauma survivor, to all of us surviving this life, but it's not the only thing. And I think it's really important that we don't overpromise as yoga teachers, and that's more hurt us and hurt our industry, I think, than being open and clear that we probably need a combination of things. Maybe some talk therapy and some embodied practices, and we can work together, and be a whole network of healing practices, and not hold on to like that we have to be the one and only thing for our students.
Yeah. I can't believe it's already almost been an hour.
Yeah.
I probably could ask you like at least 20 more questions. So I'm trying to be present with you, and also trying to decide which last one or two questions I want to ask you because they all feel important. And so I think, first of all, I'm wondering if there's any key takeaway from either this conversation or when people pick up the book, a key takeaway from the book, because there's so much information there, what would you hope is like the residue or the echo of either the book or this conversation, or maybe it's both?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Well, I hope that the big ones I think are trauma is in every room. So it's not like these people or, oh, I teach at the gym, yoga class, power yoga, 6 p.m., whatever. Like I don't have to think about this, just opening our eyes to that there's trauma in every space, in every shared space. And actually that can help us to not be so annoyed with each other. You can just like you see someone doing something, but maybe they've been through something, and you start to see that it's like one of those pictures where the picture starts to pop out. You start to see like there's a different story here than maybe the surface. So just that sensitivity of like stopping, pausing, and like, okay, what's in this space right now? There's probably trauma in this space right now. And that can just that alone adjust our how we are in space. um and then on the other end, just doing a few things, a couple things, maybe offering a second option, offering folks to keep their eyes open. We didn't really talk about that, just that alone, instead of saying your eyes have to be closed, or just thinking, is it okay, or I'm going to dim the lights right now. There's small things. It's not that you have to change your whole class and everything you ever taught is wrong. And it's not, I always tell the teachers I train, you don't have to do everything that I taught you. I'm going to teach you trauma informed to the, hopefully I'm getting really, really close to that 100%. I'm not going to get there, but, as much information as possible. Pick two things, this week to add to your class to make them a little more trauma sensitive. When they're more ingrained, embodied in your teaching, go back to the book. I have the early copy of the book. Go back to the book, or to, or wherever your resource is. And, next month or 2 months, add one more new thing, get that 1% better, 1% more aware. You don't have to do it all. But we should make a step in that direction.
Yeah. I so appreciate all of that. Okay, and then the last question I want to ask is, and you kind of started to touch on this, but I think it's an important topic to pull on just a little bit more, is the idea of self-care for the teacher
Oh
themselves. Because
yeah.
going into these settings, there's something called vicarious trauma, and you mentioned it as it relates to the practitioners within this clinical space of like they know that they can experience trauma because they're working in that setting. Like a counselor could become
Yeah.
vicariously traumatized from the experiences of their clients. So in the same way as we're holding space and healing, or holding space to allow others to heal, it can be heavy. So how do we take care of ourselves as teachers?
That is so important and such a good question. I'm really glad that you brought that into the conversation. We have a minute or two to share about that, because that's something that I always go through with my teachers that I train. It's so very, very important. And there are some simple things. There's some sweeping exercises after class, when you not in front of your students, but go quietly somewhere and sweep down the arms,
Mm,
sweep down, just sweep. It really shifts your energy. um don't just go right to the next thing. Really, it's pauses. It doesn't take 20 minutes. It takes 1 minute, but sweep down the body. Or if that doesn't work for you, something that takes, we it's not that anyone's energy is bad, it's just not ours. Or wash your hands, not just your hands, but up to the elbows. Water is very grounding. Make sure that you just take a moment and do something physical to end that and to take that energy off of you that's not yours. So you're not carrying it with you. I think it's really, really, really important. I also think all this stuff that I've talked about with not over promising, not setting up an expectation for ourselves that it's our responsibility to fix or heal anyone. This is where we get burnt out. This is a long conversation that I have in every training that I give. The burnout happens when what we want for the practitioners is more or different than what they want for themselves. And we try to make that happen, right? There's like a trying, and that's where we get that burnout and that exhaustion. When we allow for what's to emerge, what kind of healing is in the space to emerge, what kind of new knowledge is there to emerge, that's a lot less doing. And we don't leave class so exhausted, and really needing to do, to do so much big stuff to like refurbish ourselves, because we're in there open creating together, and we're not forcing, which is where a lot of the burnout happens. So those would be my big ones.
Oh, those are so good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, it's been such a pleasure. Like I said, I could go on. We could probably have like our own little mini podcast teacher training
Yeah, I mean,
in
this
this
is,
setting.
I could go on. You asked me great questions.
Thank you. And I mean, this stuff is near and dear to my heart. My father's gone in to do work in prisons, and he's always been in the trauma realm. So I've really been able to glean a lot from him, and hopefully utilize it in my teaching as well. So I could just talk about this all day. But I do want to ask, logistically, where's the best place for people to go find your book? I imagine where all books are sold, and to work with you and connect with you.
Yeah, thank you. There's the book if people are watching on video. I'm so excited about it. The Essential Guide to Trauma Sensitive Yoga, How to Create Safer Spaces for All. It's available on my website, laraland.us. And all the links to all the places. So you choose your, local bookshop, or straight from the publisher, or Amazon, and all those options are there for you. I hope you'll pick up a copy. At the very back of the book is this very, very important chapter about going out and doing service yoga. So if you're someone that's really interested in that, make sure that you don't miss that at the back, because there's a lot of sequences towards the end. But behind all those sequences is a really important bit. Also on my website, you can find my trainings and all my workshops and offerings. I'll be touring a lot, doing workshops with the book. And also my nonprofit, 3.5acres.org. You can find it on my site as well. I'm doing training through there, or if you are trauma trained and you want to get plugged into one of our partnerships and teach for us at a shelter, at a food bank, or one of those spaces, that's something that we do as well. And we're always looking for more support, being a nonprofit. And I'm at Laraland Yoga on all the social things, so I'm not hard to find, and I'm really accessible for further questions, inquiries, challenges. I'm very open to continuing this journey of learning and collaborating.
Thank you so much for the work that you do. It's really
Thank
important.
you.
And I'm so glad we get to share it with this audience. I feel
Thank you
so blessed.
so much. Thank you. I'm really appreciative of this.
Yeah.